All right, we're in Matthew 23, or into 23, actually 24 this morning. And, 23 ends with this lament, Jesus' lament. And laments, like I said, are not something that we really do today. I don't think I've ever lamented. I mean, I've probably cried. I know I've cried hard a few times. Maybe I wailed a little in my life. I don't really think so. But I've never really lamented. And the laments in the Bible are really powerful statements of grief, of sorrow, of mourning, and they're expressed in these very powerful, poetic ways, But Jesus in this lament, it was lamenting over Jerusalem, and it really leads into 24, into the discourse of 24, into what happens. As Jesus laments over Jerusalem, 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 who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is being left to you desolate. It's a very powerful statement. The house of Judah, the house of Israel, will be desolate. And when we talk about houses in Scripture, when we're really not talking, Jesus here is not talking what you would think like a literal house, but he means like their nation, the temple, the whole thing of that. Your house is being left to you desolate. And you will not see me, Jesus said, until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. So this is right at the end of Jesus' ministry. He knows this is close to the very end. And this is the beginning of that. And Jesus laments over that idea, laments over what's coming. And this is where he goes to the temple. This is, like I said, this is Herod's temple, and it's been under construction now for several decades. Not done yet, not totally done yet at the time of Jesus. It's Herod's kind of deal to appease the Jews. He spent a lot of money on it. It's very, very amazing. It's a very beautiful structure. It's where, if you look at a picture of Jerusalem today, it's on that hill where the gold dome, the Islam dome of the mount is setting now. That's the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And underneath that dome of the rock is the temple, way under there somewhere, what's left of it, the remnants of it. And it was there, though, and Jesus goes up on this hill, and he looks down. He's going away. And Jesus said, truly I say to you, not one stone will be left upon another which will not be torn down. He's sitting on the Mount of Olives. That's just a short way above Jerusalem. The disciples came to him privately, and they asked him some questions. And this is kind of the start of 24. And 24 is a real controversial passage in Christianity. It has to do with the rapture, people that believe in the rapture, premillennialism. All these things come into focus when we start talking about 24, so we're going to have to take a little time and try to decipher it a little bit. And Jesus asks these questions, 3 questions. When will these things happen? What's the sign of your coming and the end of the age? So there's 3 questions that are proposed in Matthew 24. And these 3 questions are going to have to be answered. And the way we answer them really, it dictates a lot of the doctrine, what we believe about Jesus coming again, how that's going to happen, how that's going to transpire. And those of you that know me know that I don't have the traditional view or the common popular view of how that's going to happen. So I maybe approach this a little bit different than some people do. But I think it's very powerful questions. And to them, I don't know they saw a difference in it, Jesus is going to come, the kingdom's going to start, because they're still looking for a physical kingdom here. And, the end of the age, maybe that's a different question. When we talk about ages in the Bible, we call that dispensations in the Bible, periods of time. God spoke in different ways. We talk about the time from Genesis to the Mount. We call that the patriarchal age. We call that the age where God spoke to the heads of households directly. And then the law of Moses to Jesus, we call that the Mosaic age. And now we're in the Christian age. So we're in the last age, the Bible says. We're in the last times. There won't be another time, another period after this. We're at the end of all this. So we have to break it down. And Jesus starts with this idea of people saying it's the end of time. right? Or the end. We hear that all the time, right? I hear that all the time. People say, well, it's so bad, can't go on. This has got to be the end. I hear that almost every day of my life. Somebody says that to me, or every week of my life, somebody says that to me. They say, well, this has got to be the end, That's just as bad as it can get. Jesus is going to come. And I hear that all the time, and people think that. A lot of people think that. I don't know. I don't think the Bible gives us any clues. And we'll talk about that as we get to the bottom of this. But Jesus says, don't be misled. Because a lot of you saying, I am the Christ. And at the time of Jesus, this was really going on. People were showing up, saying they're the Messiah. People were following him. We hear about that in the book of Acts. They knew it was time for the Messiah to come. They were looking for people to lead them against Rome, lead them against the powers that be. And they were looking towards that. But Jesus said, that's not it. And Jesus says there's going to be wars and rumors of wars. And don't be frightened because this thing's going to happen. But this still isn't the end. Jesus says nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes. But all these things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. Now, these things aren't going to signify anything. These wars, these rumors of war, nations against nation. We got a big war going on in the Middle East right now, right? And a lot of people are being like, this is the end, this is the big war, this is going to wind up. Well, Jesus says, that's not true. These things are going to happen. They have happened throughout history. It's not the end. Doesn't mean that, the sky is going to fall tomorrow. But we're really not even to that yet. And I think that's something we got to understand. So let's back up a little. When will these things happen? We have to ask ourselves a question. What things, right? What things specifically? Well, let's back up a little bit because we really got to keep this in context. I said I would back up. Maybe I'll back up. So we back up a little bit on this. And what did he say? The destruction of Jerusalem, right? Going away, his disciples point the temple buildings. That's the temple. You see these things? I say to you, not one stone here will be left on another which will not be torn down. So the question is not, when is the end of the world? The question is, when will this temple be destroyed? Now, to them, that might have been the same event. They might have thought, well, when Jerusalem's destroyed, when the temple's destroyed, that'll be the end. But we understand that's not the case. Jesus understood that wasn't the case. So when we get to those questions, when will these things happen? When will this thing? Well, what are we talking about? Destruction of Jerusalem. That's the first question. When will these things happen? What will be the sign of your coming? That's the second question. The last question, when will be the end of the age? Well, this will be the age, the Christian age. So those three questions. But right now we're talking about when will these things happen? What? The destruction of Jerusalem. So he says, they will kill you, you will be hated by all nations. Many will fall away, will betray one another, hate one another. False prophets will arise. Because lawlessness increase, people's love will grow cold, but the one who endures, he will be saved. This gospel of the kingdom shall be preached to the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. So when we read that, when people read that, and we even have songs, Christian songs about that talk about preaching to the whole world. When the whole world hears, problem is their world's not our world. You can't look at this through 21st century eyes because they didn't believe. The world was not, to them, was not what the world is to us, right? They were flat earth people. There was no round world in Jesus' day. These were people who lived on a flat world. That was their belief. The whole Bible, flat earth. Flat earth people believed the earth was on pillars, believed that Sheol, the Hades, was underneath the earth, and heaven was above the earth, above the firmament, as we call it in the Bible. They believed in three heavens, the air we breathe, the stars you see, and heaven above that, that's heaven. Paul says, I was caught up into the third heaven. That's what he's talking about. Their earth was not your earth, was not. They didn't know about people on the other side of the globe and people in the Amazon jungles and people that have never yet heard of the gospel. That was not their world. That was not what Jesus was talking about. You cannot read this through 21st century eyes. I've heard this argument all this time. Well, when the whole world hears, Jesus will come again. If we can bring the gospel to the whole world, our world, then Jesus will come again. But you got to understand that was not the world of Jesus. And I'm going to show that to you in Romans 1:8 and Romans 10:18. Paul says, "First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for you all, because your faith is being proclaimed throughout the whole world." You see, in their mind, it was done. That was the world. Not the world, the globe, their world. That's what Jesus is talking about. In Romans 10:18, "But I surely they have never heard, have they? Indeed they have. Their voice has gone out into all the earth, and their words to the ends of the world." You see, Paul understood as what Jesus said, it had gone. The world had heard. The whole world would hear. Because to them, that's what we were talking about, was the known world. We weren't talking about our globe, our earth. That wasn't a thing at the time of Jesus. Wasn't something they even considered. Wasn't how they viewed this. We view it totally different than they view it. You really got to keep that in mind when you read the Bible. It's hard for us to read Bible through first century eyes because we're not first century people. We're people of science. We're people of discovery. We're people that view the world, view things differently. Cause and effect to us is totally different than it was to them. We have a total different cause and effect in our life, why things happen. We view that 100% different than they did. In their mind, it was real simple. Everything came from God. Good, bad, and indifferent, sickness, health, whatever, all came from God. You and I, we have a different view of that. We have science, right? We know sickness comes, and we know what causes these things, and we just view the world different than they do. And we always have to keep that in mind as we study this. Are there any comments? I've been doing a lot of talking this morning, not much discussion yet. We'll get there. We're getting there. Okay. So that's kind of what we have to look at here. So this gets where it gets more difficult. And, you know, I could bore you to death here. I could. And I'm going to try not to. So what are we talking about here in Matthew 24:15? The abomination of desolation which spoken through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place. Let the reader understand. Does anybody know what we're talking about? Does anybody know about Daniel the prophet? Or what Daniel has to do with any of this? So, how do we know Jesus came at the right time? You know? Did Jesus come at the right time in history, do you think? How do we know that? That's right. There was a lot going on. Crucifixion, that was a big thing. That had to happen. A lot of the way the world was right. But it's deeper than that. It's the 70 weeks of Daniel, you know, and I've preached about that and taught about it, and it's way more than I can explain in 15 minutes. But the 70 weeks of Daniel, right? Daniel said there's 70 weeks in a short paraphrase, which is 490 years, okay? He said there's 490 years. There's 69 weeks and then a week. 69 weeks, and then the final week, the sacrifice will stop in the middle of the final week. All this plays into this. So when he said that, he said there'll be 70 weeks from the decree to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So the temple's been destroyed by the Babylonians. And the Babylonians reigned for 70 years, days of Jeremiah, right? And then the Medes and the Persians came into Babylon. And the Medes and the Persians, Daniel's through all this. Daniel was carried off by the Babylonians. Daniel's a Babylonian exile. He's a Babylonian exile. Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, all those guys were carried off to Babylon by the Babylonians. Daniel's book, the book of Daniel, goes through the reign of Babylon, who stay in Babylon, and then into the Mede and Persian, Xerxes, right? So what happened was Jeremiah, the prophet Jeremiah said, when Jerusalem was destroyed, he said in 70 years, you'll get to go back. And Daniel knew that prophecy. So Daniel goes to the king. Okay, so I'll back up 1 second. So, okay. So the Babylonians come in and destroy Jerusalem. And the Babylonians say, the Babylonians are they're an assimilating nation, like the Assyrians were. So the Babylonians, when they came into Jerusalem, they go, well, we're going to take all the wealthy people, all the smart people, all the good things, and we're going to carry all that back to Babylon, and we're going to turn them into Babylonians, okay? So Daniel, who was Belshazzar, right? Daniel in the Hebrew, Belshazzar in the Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, all their names were changed to Babylonian names. If you read Daniel, they were given Babylonian food because the Babylonians wanted to assimilate that knowledge into their culture, into their nation. So they were an assimilating nation. They wanted to assimilate all that into them, right? If you're a Star Trek man, it's like the Borg, right? The Borg wanted to assimilate everybody, right? So I'm kind of a Star Trek guy. So they wanted to assimilate it. So that's what happened. And so Daniel's there at 70 years. He knows from Jeremiah, 70 years from the decree to rebuild, right? 70 years, Jerusalem's going to go back. So he goes to the king of the Medes and Persians, and he says, you know, it's time for that to happen. These are the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So Ezra goes back to rebuild the temple. There's a decree. So let me back up. I'm getting ahead of myself. So the Babylonians are an assimilating country, but the Medes and Persians are not. So when the Medes come in and the Persians come in and take over Babylon, the Medes and the Persians go in and they say, hey, we don't care if you stay here. If you want to go home, go home. And they didn't do that for just the Jews. They did that for all these countries that the Babylonians had assimilated. They said, if you want to go home. We don't care. So Ezra comes along, right? Ezra comes along and Nehemiah comes along, and they decide to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. That's the second temple that Herod's going to rebuild that we just talked about. They come back to rebuild the temple. Daniel, in the book of Daniel, the angel Gabriel says, there's 70 weeks, which is 490 years. Says from the decree to rebuild the temple is 490 years till the Messiah comes. Actually, would be 6 weeks because the last week is split. So that gives us a time of when Jesus should come. So when Jesus came, it wasn't just random. God didn't just say, oh, well, the world's bad enough now, I need to throw Jesus in there. That wasn't what happened. It was already said from the book of Daniel when Jesus would come. So all these people knew, all these Jews knew, it's the time. We're looking for the Messiah. It's time for the Messiah to be here. Jesus didn't just show up. See, that's something I think we miss. This wasn't an accident. God didn't just come along all of a sudden and say, oh, well, I need to come up with a solution to these people. You know, I'm going to send Jesus down there. We're going to take care of this problem. It was already done. Matter of fact, the Bible says Jesus was slain from the foundation of the earth. So it was already determined. And so they knew it was time. And so a lot of people, and if you can read this if you want to, you can even Google this, you can look at this. Sometimes the History Channel had a show about this. There were a lot of people at the time of Jesus, we know historically, a lot of men that were raising themselves up and saying, I'm the Messiah, I'm the Jesus. They were even doing some miracles. Maybe it was just sleight of hand, but they were doing things. The people were following them. Sometimes 3,000, 5,000 people were following these people. And they were saying, oh, we're going to overthrow Rome. I'm going to be the king. I'm going to be the king of Israel. We're going to overthrow Rome, see? And, well, they weren't. But the point I'm trying to make is Jesus came at exactly the right time in history. He was supposed to show up. He was supposed to be there when he was there. That leads us into 15. So part of Daniel's prophecy is this: the abomination that causes desolation. Boy, there's so much controversy about this. What is it? What is the abomination that causes desolation? Well, in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, in that 300-year period, there was a man who came in, a nation that came in and took over Israel, which is a lot of what those books are about, and he sacrificed pigs on the altar to Zeus. Well, maybe that was it, right? Maybe that was the abomination caused desolation. Well, I don't think it was, because I think we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So if you're a Roman person, did y'all ever see that movie? What's the name of that stupid movie? Anyway, I can't remember. Where the guy comes in, the Legion guy, and anyway, he is going because they had the standard, which was an eagle on a pole. The standard of Rome was an eagle. That was the Roman symbol of power, was an eagle on a staff. So the abomination that caused desolation, standing in the holy place, that's in the temple, right? That's in the temple. So in other words, something had to stand in that temple that was desolation. And to me, that was the Roman standard. That was the eagle of Rome. Now, this is where it gets more complicated. So if you're a premillennialist, in other words, if you believe that there's going to be this battle of Armageddon, and there's going to be a rapture, and Jesus is going to come and reign on earth for 1,000 years, that's what premillennialism is. I'm not a premillennialist. That's what premillennialism is. If you believe that, you have to get a temple. You have to have a temple. So if you're a premillennialist, the temple in Jerusalem has to be rebuilt. That's a problem because there's a Muslim mosque on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem today. You see? In 1948, when we established Israel as a nation, when we went in and kicked everybody out and gave Israel that land, because that's what we did, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's what we did. We kicked everybody out, kicked them out of their town, kicked them out of their house, and established Israel, right or wrong. When we did that, a lot of people go, oh, well, this is it. Israel's going to come back as a nation. And now every time there's a war over there, like there is now, premillennialists are all jumping up and down. This is it. This is it. We're going to kick out the Muslims. We're going to rebuild the temple on the mount. We're going to restart the sacrifice, because all that has to happen if you're a premillennialist. But that's never going to happen, because that's not what this means. Because this is not about the end of the world. This is about the destruction of Jerusalem. And this is going to make sense. I'm working up to it. Okay? So, the abomination that causes desolation, to me, is Rome. The Emperor Titus, who will be the emperor, and he wasn't an emperor at the time, he besieged Jerusalem, in 70 AD, sieges Jerusalem in 70 AD, because the Zealots decide they're going to overthrow Rome. So the Roman Empire sieges Jerusalem, and they're going to destroy it, just like Jesus said. Not one stone will be left upon another. Because the temple stones, as I said last week, but I'm going to tell you again, the temple stones had no mortar. They were hewn, remember that, to build the temple? They couldn't even use a hammer or anything. Remember that? They had to make them all and haul them in and set them. There's no sound of a hammer or any tool could be made in the temple. There was no mortar. They were just stones fitted and placed on top of one another. And historically, we know when they burnt the temple, which Titus told them not to burn it, but they did. When they burned the temple, the gold, the silver, that stuff ran between those stones, and they pried them apart to get to that metal. So Jesus was right, but this is the destruction of Jerusalem. Now that's going to make more sense. So it says, those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. You see why this isn't the end of time? Because in the end of time, you're not going to be able to run from that. It's not going to matter where you go. This is about the destruction of Jerusalem. We know historically, when Jerusalem was destroyed, very few Christians died. Very few Christians died. Why? Because they left. Because Jesus said, when you see this coming, run. And he tells them right here, he says, you must flee. Whoever's on the housetop must not go down to get the things that are in his house. You got to go in a hurry. Whoever in the field must not turn back to get his cloak. Woe to those who are pregnant, those who are nursing a baby in those days. Why? Because it's hard to run. It's hard to run with little children, right? It's hard to run when you're pregnant. Okay, so maybe this will help a little bit. Boy, this is so confusing. You're going to leave here today, you're going to be, I'm so confused. It's all right. You can ask me later. Okay, so let's look at this for a minute. Okay, so this is premillennialism, okay? Right here in a nutshell. Premillennialism basically says that premillennialism, not the one I want, there you go. Premillennialism basically goes off Daniel's weeks, Daniel's 70 weeks. There's 69 weeks to the cross. 69 weeks till the Messiah shall be cut off. Okay? So that's the crucifixion. Nobody argues this. This is really straightforward. So from the time the decree goes to rebuild the temple, in 69 weeks the Messiah will come. Okay? That's 483 years. The Messiah will come. But then Daniel says there's another week. Okay? This is where we have problems. Then Daniel says there's another week. Daniel doesn't say there's a gap. But what premillennialism, the theory of premillennialism is this, basically. It's that Jesus came to save the Jews, and the Jews rejected him. So instead of him becoming an earthly king and leading the Jews and striving as an earthly kingdom, Jesus said, all right, God said, all right, it ain't going to work. So what we're going to do is we're going to start this church, and this church is going to go for an indeterminate amount of time. And then at the end of this thing, then we're going to have this rapture, okay? And then Daniel splits the last week into two sections, half the week. So at the end of 3.5 years, which is half a week, the covenant is broken and the great tribulation begins. Then there's going to be a tribulation. And then at the end of that tribulation right there, there's going to be a 1,000-year reign. That's your premillennialism. There's going to be a rapture. There's going to be a 1,000-year reign on earth. Jesus is going to rule earth for 1,000 years from Jerusalem. And then he's going to come back, and that will be the end. So that's the premise. That's why we call it premillennialism, because it's before the 1,000 years. All right? Because 1,000 years, we got out of Revelation 20, right? There'll be 1,000 years. Remember that? That's where we get that out of Revelation 20. That's where the 1,000 years comes from. So that's the idea of premillennialism, basically. In the middle of the week, the sacrifice will cease, Daniel says. In the middle of the last week, the sacrifice will cease. That's really one of the big problems with premillennialism. And if you listen to like Bot Radio and those guys that are big premillennialists, they're going to tell you, oh, we're already building the stuff for the temple. We're already building the stuff to redo the temple because the temple's got to start. For this to happen, for this actually to happen, the way people believe it, the Muslim mosque, all that's going to have to go away. We're going to have to rebuild a temple in Jerusalem. We're going to have to start the sacrifice again. And then we're going to have to stop the sacrifice in 3.5 years. For this literally to happen the way they say it, that's what has to happen. Now, let's move forward a little bit. So, this is the way I see it. Nobody denies Jesus coming in 483 years from the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. So Jesus comes just when he's supposed to come. Jesus shows up just when he's supposed to show up. But then it says, the sacrifice will cease. Well, when Jesus showed up, essentially, the sacrifice would cease. 3.5 years, when Jesus was crucified, the Messiah comes. 3.5 years, the sacrifice will cease. Jesus was crucified. Jesus' ministry was 3.5 years long. We know that from John's gospel. So 3.5 years into it, Jesus was crucified. At the point Jesus was crucified, the sacrifice no longer counted because Jesus is the perfect sacrifice for our sins. So even though the temple was still there, and even though they were still slaughtering animals on an altar, it was irrelevant. The sacrifice ceased when Jesus hung on the cross. And then in 3.5 years, Stephen was stoned, and the church spread into all the world. To me, that's the 70 weeks of Daniel, without getting a lot more deep than we've got, and I can probably confuse you a whole lot more than I've confused you. Those are basically the two views of Daniel, how that works out. So either you're a premillennialist or you're, yeah, go ahead. Because that was the dispersia, when Stephen was stoned, the church left Jerusalem and went, when Steve was stoned, everybody left Jerusalem and went home. You had the ingathering after the church started, right after Pentecost, you had the ingathering, Acts chapter 2. Everybody stayed there, sold their property, had everything in common. Then when Stephen was stoned in Acts 7, that was the dispersia, we call it. Everybody left to go home because everybody was scared they were going to be stoned too, so the church spread into the whole world. And to me, that's the explanation of the 70 weeks of Daniel. Like I said, this is something, even when you talk about premillennialism, there's 50 different brands of premillennialism. There's post-tribulation, pre-tribulation, there's amillennialism, there's premillennialism, there's postmillennialism, there's a million different views of this. But they make it way too complicated. It's not that complicated. I'm just telling you. The world likes it, premillennialism, because it sells, you know. It's a big thing to say Jesus is going to come back. What makes sense about that to anybody, you know? Jesus didn't come to kill off the world. If he wanted to be king, he could have been king. He rejected that. They tried to make him king. If you remember that in John's gospel, they tried to force him to be king, and he withdrew himself. Jesus told Pilate specifically, he said, my kingdom's not of this world. If it was, my disciples would rise up and fight. But as it is, my kingdom's from another realm. Jesus understood his kingdom was a spiritual kingdom, not a physical kingdom. And some warped part of us, and I don't know what warped part that is, because I don't think it's a very Christian attitude. Some warped part of Christianity says, we want Jesus to come, we want him to punish all the bad people and kill them and wipe them out and prove to everybody that we're right. And that's not the Jesus that I worship. It's not. The Jesus that I worship is not a Jesus that comes to kill people and prove that he's right. The Jesus that I worship is someone who loves us, who wants to give us salvation, who wants to give us heaven, and who teaches us to love one another. When I was a child and I used to read that verse, every knee shall bow and every mouth shall confess that Jesus is Lord. I loved that verse as a kid because I'm like, yeah, I'm going to show them I'm right. And now, the older I get, the more I dread the day. You know, I dread the day. If Jesus came today, I would love it if Jesus would come, but I dread that day because to me, the glory of Jesus coming will be overshadowed by the pain of all those who will not be saved. I don't see Jesus that way. I just don't. I don't see Jesus as a vengeful, warring God. I don't see Jesus that way. And I don't think the Bible teaches that kind of a Jesus. And I think if you're a premillennialist, what are you looking for? What do you want? You want this earth's done. He's done with this earth, you know? And I just think it's a false view. And I think, once again, here we are, still talking about destruction of Jerusalem. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, which is Rome, recognize her desolation is near. Right? Those who are in Judea must flee. Those who are in the midst, this is out of Luke. I switched Gospels on you. This is the Luke equivalent of Matthew. And he says, those who are in the midst of the city must leave. Those who are in the country must not enter the city because these are days of vengeance, so that all things that are written will be fulfilled. Woe to you who are pregnant, those who are nursing babies, for there will be great distress upon the land and wrath to this people. And they will fall by the edge of the sword and will be led captive into all the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles, and the times of the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. And I think that pretty well is exactly what happened. Jerusalem was destroyed by Rome in 71 AD. And if you want to Google the history of Jerusalem from there on out, you know what you're going to find? It was a very bloody, bad, warring place to be, and it still is to this very day, and it will be until Jesus comes again because it's never going to stop. And I think that's just the fact of it right there. So, thanks for your time this morning. It's good to see you. I will see you again in a minute.